played Atari today.
Greetings, it's Adam with Errata Non Grata, and happy birthday, 53rd birthday to Atari. On June 27th, 1972, they started business. It was Ted Dabney and Nolan Bushnell were partners who had created Computer Space, an arcade machine that they developed for a company called Nutting Associates in the year prior, but they had decided they wanted to strike it out on their own, and so they created this company called Atari, which a few months later would release Pong, which would change the world of gaming as we know it, and give us essentially the industry that we have today. There's no way to know what the industry would have been like had Atari not been around. I'm sure video games would have become the mass industry that they are at some point. It's just since it got started in 1972, then that led to all the other things that would eventually build gaming into what it's become. For better or for worse. But instead of playing some Atari games today, I wanted to finally fulfill a long-held promise. I've done videos about all sorts of unreleased Atari consoles, including the Super Stella 3200, the Atari Cosmos, the Atari Super XE, even the Atari Jaguar 2. But for some reason, I decided to skip the Panther. Not really sure why I did that, but overall, the Panther, it's not the most mysterious machine out there because there's actually a lot of information available about it. I guess the problem is that a lot of the information that's been out there on the internet has been wrong on it. For a long time, this was rumored to be an Atari ST based game console, or some even put out rumors that it was based on the Lynx. Now, in my humble opinion, before we get into everything, I do think that Atari should have taken the hardware of the Lynx and developed something that was more appropriate for working on television sets. Like, I'm not saying that they shouldn't have done the Lynx. I think they definitely should have. I'm just saying they should have also taken that hardware, added a little more power to it, and then I don't know if it would have been feasible to allow you to take Lynx cartridges and plug them into either platform, and then you just get better graphics out of the one. I mean, in a way, that would be like the Nintendo Switch, and of course, that's totally hindsight 2020. Nobody was thinking of that back in the 1980s. To do something like that. Although plenty of people had thought about stuff back in the 90s as far as, hey, is there a way to connect your Lynx to the TV and play it on there? Anyways, let's get into the Atari Panther, which you see here on the screen. This is a 3D rendering of the console, which is based upon technical specifications, which actually have been out there. I believe this originally came from, here it says the technical drawings was posted to 4chan, but I think that it was Curt Vendel who had originally found these and posted them onto the internet. And so somebody just took this stuff, created a 3D rendering of it. This case, I don't believe it ever been produced, or if they did, they might have had one or two prototypes. Kind of interesting in a way that they decided not to use it for the Jaguar, but it's a fairly compact system. But I guess before we really get into that, we need to get into a little bit of history there. And so, of course, if you're not very well versed in history, Atari, of course, when they started off back in 1972, it was exclusively arcade machines, games like Pong and Space Race and Gotcha, and several others that a lot of people actually haven't heard of, that are a bit obscured by time at this point. But we're still very significant in the development of other games. But anyways, they would eventually release the Atari 2600 and 5200. There would be the industry crash. The 7800 came out a little bit later than it was supposed to. It was supposed to come out in 1984. It said that from Curt Vendel, and I know not everybody believes everything that he says, but he's one that did provide some information as far as showing that the Tramiels were trying to, or were preparing to do a release of the 7800 in late 1984 as they produced some marketing materials for it. But Curt had said that apparently there was a payment dispute between Warner and the Trammels and the company that had developed the Atari 7800. Either way, the 7800 ended up launching in September 1986, and then not long after that, Atari decided to release the XEGS. And after both of those systems were out onto the market, and of course you had the Atari ST series, and I think it was 1988 when the STE came out. The company was looking to do something new in game console hardware, because the one issue with both the 7800 and the XEGS is they were based on old hardware at that point. They weren't brand new cutting edge. And of course, Sega in 1988 came out with the Sega Genesis, known as the Mega Drive in Europe, and that blew everybody's minds. It was the really cool console. It was a 16-bit console, of course, and as I've mentioned before, bits don't matter that much, or at least as much as companies like Sega and then later Atari would make it seem. But that still, with that, Atari still wanted to have something that could compete with the Genesis, and obviously the 7800 or the XEGS was not it. And as I covered in the Atari Super XE video, they were looking at some things that were still based on some of that old hardware. In fact, the Super XE was this weird mutant version of the XEGS and the Atari 7800, and it would have been perhaps interesting if they were able to get that out in 1988 or 89, but it still might not have been able to compete with the Genesis. And so the Panther work on that began in earnest back in 1988. According to this site here, Control-Alt-Res, and I believe a lot of his information, or I'm not sure if this is Ross Silliphant, who's known as Lost Dragon on Atari Age. Either way, I know Ross had compiled a lot of information on the Panther, and Control-Alt-Res has an awful lot of information, and then there'll be another blog we'll look at here from Valentino Miazzano, who has provided a lot of info here. But in the early days of the Panther, there were two teams that were looking at new console hardware, and one wanted to make something based upon the ST, whereas another team wanted to create something from scratch. And the team that wanted to create something from scratch won out, and that included Leonard Trammell, one of the Trammell sons. And so that's where they decided to go full bore on that. Now, one interesting thing with the Panther there, according to Leonard, was the reason why they wanted to go this exact route. And so, as Leonard says in his statement on the Atari Museum Facebook page from, I think this was 2017, maybe 2018, is that the Panther was designed for what turned out to be a fluke of market conditions, where there was an extreme shortage of DRAM, and the requirements that his team had come up with was, let's make a game machine that has no DRAM in it at all, and we'll see that a little bit later when we talk about memory. And so he says that a few of us got together, came up with the specs for the machine that were implemented by the same engineer that did the ST video chip. That machine was basically all scaled sprites that could automatically be moved each frame with no work by the CPU. We called it an object processor after the object list in the 400-800. No screen buffer in DRAM. And the chip was almost complete when the engineer quit. We hired a consultant to finish the chip, and while he was there, his group was hired and they did the Jaguar. There were lots of other details here, but they don't matter for this story. The guy working on the Panther chip said he really liked the idea, and it'd be easy to add scaling functionality to the Jaguar with minimal work, very few extra gates on the chip, and no reduction in performance. So we said, great, and that's how the Jaguar got an object processor. But I guess a little bit of that's getting ahead of ourselves, but still that gives you a little bit of background on to the Panther's development. Now, Curt Vendel had posted a document to his Atari Museum Facebook page a long time ago called the High Performance 68,000, we'll just say the 68K for the Motorola 68K based game machine. And that document was dated December 7th, 1988, where it contained the basic specs of the Panther, which would change a little bit between then and 1991 when it was, of course, canned. But we'll get into the cancellation of the Panther a little bit later. On the name, well, it's unknown who exactly picked the name. I would assume it would be Sam Trammell at the end of the day. Curt Vendel had shared on Facebook that he was going through a notebook doing research, and he found all these trademarks filed in 1991 for owl, wren, bluebird, cougar, falcon, cheetah, sparrow, jaguar, panther, leopard, and tiger. And so obviously somebody was really looking at animal names for that, and somebody, again probably Sam Trammell, had decided Panther sounds the coolest for the system that we're working on. But to help distinguish, I imagine the reason they didn't continue on with the name when it moved over to the Jaguar was because the Jaguar had been given a separate designation when it had started already, and for a time both systems were being worked on concurrently. And of course, you can see, they did pick these names for some other things like the Atari Falcon, and I think there was a Sparrow project. But chances are that one of these names would have ended up on some other hardware, such as I'm sure the Jaguar 2 might have ended up being called something else, like maybe the Leopard or the Tiger or the Cheetah or the Cougar. All right, so let's get into the tech specs of this Panther machine. This is all on paper stuff. What's on paper oftentimes does not translate over to reality. But still, on paper, the Panther was a mean little machine for 1991, had it released then. My guess is, from the sounds of it, it might have ended up very late 1991, maybe 1992. But either way, it was a Motorola 68K based system. Here's a chart that compares it with some other systems at the time, including some arcade boards, as there were several arcade hardware boards and games, as I note here, that used a 68K processor. The Panther was clocked at 16 megahertz, which was the same clock speed is found on the Capcom CPS2 and the Atari Games' G1 system. Interestingly enough, the Jaguar ran at a slower clock speed than this. I don't know why. I'm guessing there must be some sort of technical reason as to why they slowed it down even more for the Jaguar. Still odd to me. But it would have ran faster than the Neo Geo AES MVS, the CPS board, which ran Street Fighter II, the Genesis, and of course the Atari ST and the Amiga. But that is essentially something that was carried over from the Panther to the Jaguar. In my opinion, that was a big mistake. The Jaguar they did create some prototypes with the Motorola 68020 and the 68030. My understanding, or my guess, is that the reason they didn't go with those is due to cost, but it's really like they should have included one of those more powerful processors, probably the 68030, to help it at least hold up better against something like the PlayStation. But of course, they, again, hindsight 2020. Next up, let's look at the RAM of the machine. And so the RAM, this is, as mentioned in that line from Leonard Trammell earlier, this is something that's oftentimes a little bit strange when you look at the Panther spec, just because of how little RAM that it has. Now, what it was using was something called SRAM, or static RAM. Static RAM was often used inside of CPUs because it was very, very fast, but it was also a bit expensive, and so you sacrificed the amount, the quantity, for the speed on that one. And as mentioned, at the exact time when the Panther was being developed, prices for DRAM, as it was known, if I'm recalling correctly, that was like dynamic RAM, was pretty, they were high, but also it was scarce. It was hard to get a hold of those chips, and so it was like, let's develop a console that will work with a small amount of memory and be expandable, and also be able to work using the ROM in conjunction with the ROM. And so that's one thing about the Panther, as well as the Jaguar, that it was capable of doing, which also is something that the Neo Geo MVS could do, in that you could use your ROM space as memory. And so the graphics data from the system could fetch the graphics straight off of the cartridge and use that as though it was the RAM. Whereas systems like the SNES and the Genesis could not do that. You had to load that graphics data into the video RAM, and then you had to fetch it from there. And so that could be seen as an advantage if it was handled correctly. But from what I've read, the Panther was theoretically expandable up to 96 kilobytes of RAM, which still isn't a ton, but it's better than the 32 base. And that could be achieved both through the adding extra RAM chips on the cartridge as well as using the Panther expansion port. Now, of course, the Jaguar itself ended up with 2 megabytes of DRAM, 4 kilobytes of SRAM, 8 kilobytes of SRAM on the DSP. And so the situation had changed by that point. But of course, the Jaguar probably could have used 4 megabytes of RAM by the time it came out to hold toe-to-toe with everything else. Now, another thing to point out is that with the cartridge port, this could handle up to 6 megabytes of ROM at 4 megahertz speeds, and this is actually the same amount of space that the Jaguar could address. Oddly enough, though, I mean, probably just due to costs, Atari never took advantage of that. Kind of like the 7800. The 7800 could handle up to 144 kilobyte ROM cartridges, but it never actually used anything that high. I think the highest in any commercial release got was 64 kilobytes, maybe 128 on 1 or 2 games. But the Panther would come with some interesting features. There was the Panther chip, which is the heart of the system, but embedded within that chip was what was called the object processor. Now, as mentioned before, as Leonard mentioned, the object processor is the chip that Atari developed in-house, which is unusual. Most of the time when it comes to game consoles, you just take a bunch of different off-the-shelf parts and put them together with your motherboard in your unique way to create your game console. You know, that's how a lot of arcade machines were developed too. It was rare for companies to spend the money on developing a chip from the ground up to do that, but to put into their game console. But that's what Atari was doing with their object processor, and of course this is something that evolved into what was eventually used on the Jaguar. Now, the Jaguar would have a much more powerful version of this. By then it would be, aside from being a 64-bit version in the Jaguar, they expanded its capabilities, and they also combined it with a blitter chip in the Jaguar, whereas on the Panther there was no blitter. The Panther did have this another chip that was called the Game Shifter chip, which dealt mostly with the color palettes and the screen resolution. But the object processor, the idea, and this here is from the Valentino Miazzano webpage, where this is what generated the graphics, and it was actually similar, according to Valentino, to modern GPUs and how it worked. And it draws rectangles instead of triangles. The buffer is just one scan line, and the list of commands, known as the object list or the OL, are executed at every scan line instead of every frame. And the line buffer is on that aforementioned Game Shifter chip. And theoretically, there's no limit to the objects in the object list except for the size of your RAM and the available time to process it, which is the same kind of bottleneck that the Jaguar has. But overall, this is why like Atari systems don't have video RAM like most other consoles do. And or as we saw in the chart earlier with the different memory sizes, stuff like the Genesis and the SNES both had video RAM chips, whereas the Atari systems did not. But if you're wondering why this chip, why they were doing this, so this chip was designed again to be able to fetch graphics data from a ROM, not just from the memory itself, and be able to do that without taxing the CPU. Whereas that was very different compared to like the SNES and whatnot, where the CPU was being taxed when you were doing all those sorts of things. And so there could be trade-offs with doing that, by my understanding. Again, I'm not more than a beginner programmer, and I don't claim to fully understand what goes on inside the guts of these systems all the time, though I'm willing to learn. But either way, back at this time, 2D was king. Sprites, as we call them, not the soft drink, but the two-dimensional objects. If you could get big, colorful sprites on the screen, and if you could do stuff like scale them or rotate them, that made for a cooler graphics look, and as well as doing special effects. And of course, if you could throw more sprites onto the screen, that was a benefit as well. On really old consoles like the 2600 or the NES, if you put too many objects on the screen at once, you get flicker. On more contemporary machines of the late 80s like this Genesis or the SNES, you could put too many objects on the screen, it was more slowdown. And so this idea here was to, let's save on RAM, which is expensive and hard to get, and be able to throw a lot of sprites around the screen, so you could do Robotron 2084 with extra colors, perhaps. I don't know. But if we look at this chart shows the theoretical number of sprites that systems could display on the screen at one time. The Panther theoretically could handle 2,000 at a time. In a way, you could maybe say it was really just limited again by the amount of memory and the bandwidth that you had available. The Jaguar was the same sort of thing. I've seen many times where it just say unlimited sprites, but limited by the available RAM. So it's like it's not really unlimited in that case. But still more than what the Neo Geo MVS, the SNES, or the Sega Genesis were capable of doing. And so that would be a big advantage. Also, the resolution on the Panther was pretty standard, 320 by 200. Now, back in the 80s, it was very common to have your digital devices outputting really weird display modes or strange resolutions. Particularly with computers, they could handle different resolutions at different color depths. But game consoles usually didn't have a whole lot of different settings like that. Sometimes they would, like say the Atari 7800 had the 160 modes and the 320 line modes. But for the Panther, 320 by 200 was its standard. The Jaguar could reach up to 720 by 576, but I think in practice the Jaguar ran at 320 by 200 or somewhere close to that. Maybe more lines on the 200 side, maybe up to like 262 or something like that. But decent, not as much as the SNES, but then we get into colors on the screen, and so there were color lookup tables on the Panther, and it would have had a color palette of 262,144 colors, and it could display, theoretically, 7,860 on screen at one time, which would have put it ahead of the Neo Geo, the SNES, basically all of its contemporaries. The Jaguar would improve on that greatly by being able to go up to the full 32-bit color depth, which would include transparencies of 16.7 million colors. But the Panther, just like the Atari 7800 or even the Atari 2600, it was no slouch on color. That was something that Atari was always really good at doing on all of their consoles. They were able to output a lot of colors onto the screen, and so the Panther wouldn't have been an exception there. Now, one place where the Panther was not, that Atari systems in general were not great was audio. Now, of course, the Atari 5200 and the XEGS, the Atari 8-bit computers, had the Pokey chip, which was fine for the early 80s. The Atari STs had a Yamaha chip. I'm forgetting the exact number on that, like a 2161 or 41 or something like that, 44, I can't remember. But, of course, the Atari 7800 had the distinct disappointment of using the Atari 2600's TIA chip, and that meant that its sounds were not much better than the 2600s were. And compared to the NES, which was dominant for many reasons, but that was just another reason to have an NES over something like an Atari, was they had actual music, nice music in their games, whereas oftentimes in 7800 games they wouldn't have music, they just have sounds, and they sounded like really old sounds. And so I guess with the Panther, they decided, hey, let's fix that, and let's grab a Ensoniq ES5505 chip, which was used in some Taito arcade games. And so we can actually listen to some of that right now. And so, as you could hear from those quick samples, there was that allowed it to that would have meant that the Panther would have had some good music on it. Now, granted, that's limited by the abilities of the musicians that Atari might hire or third parties might use on it, but would it have been capable of good sound? Yeah, would have been. They probably would have been able to claim arcade quality sound on a lot of their games had they gotten that far. And again, it was pretty good compared to a lot of the contemporaries of the time. Now, the Jaguar would not use that sort of thing. It would use a customized digital signal processor, which, so far as I'm aware, had plenty of good capabilities to it. But here on this, on the Control Alt Re's page about the Atari Panther, this is showing the daughter board card that came with the Panther development kit, and it has some technical data on that exactly and what that would have come with. Now, the controllers for the Jaguar, Curt Vendel said that he was looking through stuff on the Ensoniq. It was also known as the Otis sound system for the Panther. He found that initially they were looking at something that looked just like the Sega Genesis controller, but then I guess somebody decided, oh, we can't copy them on that, so let's slap a keypad on it, and that became the maybe it was the Atari STE, and then later the Falcon gamepad, and then of course became the mostly hated Jaguar pad and all that. All that is gets into the details as far as what the tech specs were. Now, if we jump over to Valentino Miazzo's page, here he goes into the hardware, declared features, and such. Gets into how, where he looks over the tech specs. He's dived into the developer manual, from my understanding, and came up with, so on paper the stuff sounds nice, but in practice, or at least due to the bugs that existed in the Panther, it most likely would not have been able to produce what it was claiming on paper there. And so he's saying that it has something to do with the color lookup tables known as CLUTs. CLUTs. And he gets into some stuff here, but I guess again the problem is that since the Panther wasn't finished, there's like no actual prototype board for the Panther itself. All that exists is a development kit, which yes, you could use to create things that would be for the intended target system, but there still would have been some differences, and until you had a mass-produced system, there would be some guesswork there. And so looking at the bugs that existed in the hardware because it was unfinished, I think it was Leonard Tramiel had said something like the problem is that the Atari had sent the specs and all the technical stuff that they needed to the manufacturer to come up with a prototype board, but when they got the chips in, the chips didn't work. And so because of that, that it was around that time in May 1991 where they said, you know what, the Jaguar is progressing really well here, and it looks like it's going to be far more powerful, so let's just stop wasting money on this Panther thing, because it's going to take a lot of money to fix all of these problems just to get these chips to work, and then there still might be some bugs that could cause problems, and then go from there. But and so on this Atari Panther Part 3, he does, Valentino talks a lot about some of the problems that the Panther has, at least again from the development kit and the manual and developer's manual, and gets into the fact that there were a lot of limitations. And so one of the limitations that he also brings up, I mean, aside from probably wouldn't have been able to display all 7,860 colors on the screen at the same time, talks about gen lock and some limitations with the sprites and all that, and actually displaying that many sprites. Here's one takeaway line. From these calculations, it's evident that the hardware is far away from being capable of displaying 2,000 meaningful sprites. So again, paper's fine, and you can say whatever you want on paper, but in practice, it's another thing entirely. But again, I guess we can give a little bit of leeway as far as, perhaps if Atari had fixed the bugs and the issues and actually gave us something to work with, then that wouldn't have been as much a problem. Another issue that Valentino mentions is that when working with the ROM, it slows the CPU down by 50%, and so you would want to be using the SRAM as much as possible, but of course that kind of defeated the purpose of the system in the first place, because it's like they wanted to have a system that could work with as little RAM as possible, but if you want to avoid slowing down the CPU, you need to work from the RAM. You see the problem there? He also mentions some other bottlenecks, he mentions on scenes with a lot of sprites on the screen, the CPU can basically work only during the V-blank, which means that on NTSC machines, 24% of the time. On PAL systems, it would have been 18% of the time. And so that could have massively caused problems with getting games to work. But overall, what does this mean in practice? And so again, the thing that the title of this video is, how powerful was the Atari Panther? So again, we don't know for certain because there isn't an actual system to use. Now, Jeff Minter did create some tech demos of that, and there was stuff shown in different game magazines way back in the day. And I'll put this stuff here. So like these screenshots that are a little bit fuzzy come from a tech demo that Jeff Minter had put together that was published in GamesX magazine in July 1991. Funny enough, 2 months after the Panther had been officially canceled at Atari. But it looks like he was just showing how many sprites could go on the screen. Again, just a tech demo, not something that would work with the games. But just gives you kind of an idea of a little bit of the coloring going on. You see some of the gradients in the background, which is something that the Jaguar would use fairly often. And now, of course, Atari, for their marketing, they were claiming that, of course, this is going to totally beat out the Super Famicom or the SNES and all that. But okay, I'm sorry. As I read these as I'm talking here, it looks like that the Atari Panther revealed does discuss that it was canceled in favor of the Jaguar, which at the time they were claiming was going to be out in 1992. And perhaps if the Jaguar had made it out in 1992 with the same games, perhaps it would have done a little better because it would have had more time. Yeah, here's another one, another photo of the Antelope demo that Jeff Minter had done, or you can see colors and resolution here that he was managing to throw around, and I guess also experimenting with how many colors he could throw up on the screen. This photo looks like, or he says, the game magazine had said this static screenshot may not look impressive, but you should see this particular demo in motion. The asteroids begin as tiny sprites in the distance, then the Panther sprite scaling abilities are put to good effect, bringing them hurling forwards at a phenomenal speed. But I think overall the final word on this is, at least, again, based on the hardware that existed that had a lot of technical bugs and such with the that were in place, and okay, this page at Control-Alt-Rees also collects a lot of Leonard's own Facebook posts in the Atari Museum, some of which I've shown here, that yeah, it most likely would have been weaker than the SNES or the Sega Genesis. Again, more colorful and perhaps better sounds, but might have been hampered by slowdown or needing to limit the amount of sprites to avoid anything like slowdown and whatnot. Doesn't sound like it had anything quite like Mode 7, so it might have been capable of doing Mode 7 like stuff, but it would have to do it in software, and that can be a lot slower than having hardware support for it. And you also just, yeah, there's a lot of issues there that would have had to have been sorted out to see if it could get up to spec and really compete with its contemporaries. And so at the end of the day, I would guess that Panther games would have been like lower resolution Jaguar games, lower resolution, lower color Jaguar games. And that's probably not something you would want to be showing off. When obviously, if Atari had released this, they would have touted it as a 32-bit game console, and that implication would have been far superior to the Sega Genesis and the SNES. And funny enough, the Jaguar, it was far more capable than the Panther was, and yet in practice, oftentimes maybe due to its bugs or just not enough resources behind the games, there are plenty of games which don't look all that much better and sometimes worse than their Genesis or SNES counterparts, like Pitfall. The Mayan Adventure is one. Now, I do believe that with the right programming and optimization, that sure, something like Pitfall should have been able to do better than what it did, and perhaps it was just being hired out to the lowest bidder to just get something out there. But still, just kind of goes to show, it's not just the hardware that matters. What matters is the developers and the resources that they have behind it. Of course, the more power that you can get out of the machine back in those days, the better. That would make it easier to handle all that stuff. And so, like I mentioned at the beginning of this, my view is that they should have focused on enhancing the Lynx hardware and release that as a console, because I would think that you could or that Lynx developers could have concurrently developed both Lynx and Panther games at the same time if they had shared certain abilities. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it would have been technically capable of taking a Lynx cartridge and plugging it into a Panther. But still, if you were able to concurrently develop the games at the same time for both systems, and then just the Panther version could get better artwork and such, and then it's like, sure, maybe if it had come out, if they had done that and had it out around the time of the Lynx or in 1990, then that might have been enough to give Atari a boost going into getting the Jaguar ready, and maybe delayed the Jaguar a little bit, maybe into 1994, and given it a little bit more power, such as using it instead of the Motorola 68K, which was the big bottleneck in the Jaguar, giving it a 68020 or a 68030, something like that. But without a time machine, there's no way for us to really know how these things might have ended up and how the chips would have fallen. How they fell is how they fell, and that's what we have to deal with. But of course, if we had a time machine, it'd be kind of immoral to go back in time and just fix video game history for one company. There's far more important things to go back and fix if you had a time machine, if that was your purpose in using one. But anyways, that's most likely how the Panther would have been. Let me know what you think about that. Comments below, and happy birthday to Atari, and we'll catch you on the next video.